he just couldn't believe that he'd lost another son. Just really broke him.
When the villagers found out, they were shocked, because it's such a quiet, peaceful village.
It was a pre-planned and well thought out murder.
In April 2003, the Nottingham village of Edwinstowe was shocked by the news that one of its residents had been found dead in the room of a local hotel, with his wrists and his neck elaborately bound. Was this a bondage session gone wrong? Or was it murder? In the heart of Sherwood Forest is the Nottinghamshire village of Edwinstowe. Legend has it that the village church was where Robin Hood married Maid Marian, and it still retained all of its charm.
Edwinstowe is a quiet village. It's a very tight-knit community, lots of very friendly people willing to talk to you on the street and help you out when you're in need.
On the evening of 25th of April 2003, panicked Edwinstowe resident Carol Croydon contacted her brother-in-law concerned about her missing husband, Philip.
I had a phone call from Carol asking me if Phil was with me. I said, no, he's not with me. Why? Was there a problem? She said he'd gone missing and she didn't know where he was. I was just a little worried because it just wasn't like Phil to do that, to disappear without saying anything to anyone. I left it for probably 15, 20 minutes and thinking, what could have happened, where could he have gone? So I called Phil on his mobile. It went straight to Anne's phone as though his phone was switched off. After that, I rang Carol and said, look, I've tried to contact Phil. His phone's just gone straight to voicemail. And, I don't know where he is. I contacted my sister, I think, then, and told her what was going off, but not to tell my parents because the amount of stress they've suffered in the past with losing 2 other children. So I didn't want to worry them. So we kept it to ourselves that, we couldn't find Phil and no one knew where he was.
Although he hadn't told his parents, Stephen did share his concerns with his sister.
He told me that Phil had gone missing and he'd been missing overnight, but I shouldn't worry about it because he'd spoken to Carol and Carol had said that she thought maybe Phil was suffering from depression.
Initially, Carol's assurances did the job of calming the family down, but it didn't last long, and they reported Philip missing to the police before going to bed.
I had a few hours sleep, and then when I woke in the morning, the first thing I did was to ring Carol to see if he'd turned up at home. He wasn't at home, and then I just rang his mobile again, and it went straight to Anne's phone again. At that point I decided maybe I should go and look for him, because if it fell out, he may have gone somewhere and just parked up for the night and spent the night in his car.
I came and parked down here on the Saturday morning about 8:30, because this is the area where myself and my brother used to fish all the time. I went over to the nature reserve area first, which is one of the popular fishing spots where we used to go. Couldn't see anything. Then went down to the church over there, nothing down there. I then drove across the bridge and down towards the river, searching all the lakes, but I couldn't see anything.
By now, Stephen's brother Philip had been missing for over 10 hours.
At that point I was very worried, because him not responding to any calls, not letting anyone know where he was, totally out of character for Phil. Normally, he's very family loving, and he wouldn't put us through any, especially Mum and Dad, he wouldn't put us through that sort of stress. So at that point I feared there was something worse.
I'd just got flashes of my mum and dad running through my mind, thinking, you know, how they're going to cope losing another brother, another son.
In the early hours of the 26th of April, a shocking discovery was made 36 miles from Edwinstowe.
We received a phone call from an employee of a hotel that had found a body in a bedroom of the hotel. Officers arrived at the room in question, and it was immediately apparent that there was blood at the scene, and the man himself had got his hands tied. He'd also got a scarf across his eyes, at the back of his head. It's certainly an unusual set of circumstances.
Immediately, police set about organising what they believed to be a crime scene.
Police officers took steps to secure the corridor and the room itself so that no one else was allowed anywhere near it. The senior officer called out for the forensic services and the pathologist to attend the scene. Certainly they spent some considerable time there taking samples for fingerprints, DNA, fibres, that sort of thing. It was apparent from the amount of blood around that it was a suspicious incident. We were able to identify the man, Mr. Philip Croydon, and that was from his driving licence.
Philip's wife Carol and his family were completely unaware that their worst fears had been realised, but it was the police's job to inform them of the news.
When officers told Carol Croydon that her husband had been found dead in a hotel, she was clearly very distressed.
She was hysterical at the time. She was really, really distraught. She couldn't understand what he'd been doing in a hotel room, and she wanted answers.
Unaware their brother had been found dead, Stephen and Sandra were on their way to Carol's in Edwinstowe to make sure she was okay.
I received a call and was on the way up there to say that Phil had been found in a hotel and he was dead.
It was such a shock that I kind of panicked a little bit, but it's happened and we've got to go and face and find out what the story is.
Stephen and Sandra continued their journey to see their sister-in-law.
When we got to the house, Carol was there. She was upset, but probably not as upset as the rest of us.
When we walked in the house, there were probably 5 or 6 police officers there, because Carol had fed him the information that Phil was depressed. So Steve said, I hope he hasn't committed suicide. Obviously thinking about my mum and dad again, Steve, we need to tell my mum and dad. And so the 2 police liaison officers drove with us up to my mum and dad's house.
First went to the parents' address, to Ted and Marg, and the rest of the family were all at their house. I was with a colleague at the time. There was brother and sister, Steve and Sandra. Employed as a family liaison officer, involved with interaction with the victim's family, to interview them about the victim, the lifestyle, the background of that person, and to liaise with them and keep them fully updated with every step of the investigation.
My dad knew straight away that something bad was wrong, and I told him that Phil had died. My dad was probably worse than my mum. He was absolutely distraught. He was in bits. Just kept saying, God, why? Just didn't. He couldn't deal with it. I think with losing 2 sons before that, he just couldn't believe that he'd lost another son. So just really broke him.
Despite having just received the heartbreaking news about their son, Philip Croydon's parents' thoughts quickly turned to his widow.
Carol stopped and spoke to my dad and my mum for a little while, and then made her excuses, saying she had a headache and she wanted to go to bed, and would I help her to get in bed. My dad kissed Carol as she went upstairs to bed, and told her to try and get some rest.
The family grieved and tended to a distraught Carol.
I went to help her get undressed and put some pyjamas on and get into her bed, while we all sat downstairs, discussing and kind of guessing what might have happened to Phil.
In the hotel, the police investigation was unearthing more details surrounding Philip Croydon's death.
The Home Office pathologist arrived at the scene, examined the body of Mr. Croydon, and it became apparent that he'd received numerous stab wounds to the back of the neck and also to the chest. The ties that had been tied to his wrists and the scarf that had been placed over his head, it was his opinion that these had been placed or tied on after death. They were so tight that there was no discoloration of the wrists, or no reaction when they were untied. And in relation to the scarf that had been placed over his head, he suggested that would have fallen off in an assault. So it was quite clear that this had happened after death. And it was our opinion that whoever had done this had wanted to make it look like a sexually orientated assault.
Now police were certain they had a murder case on their hands. And whilst Carol was grieving with the Croydon family, they checked a new potential lead. CCTV footage of the previous night from the hotel cameras was found and examined. It showed Philip Croydon entering the hotel alone at 5:09. What officers were hoping was that it would identify Philip Croydon's killer. The police were one day into investigating the death of Philip Croydon from the Nottinghamshire village of Edwinstowe. He'd been found in a local hotel room with multiple stab wounds and his hands and neck bound. Philip's wife Carol had reported him missing on the night of the killing. Police had already concluded this wasn't a sex game gone wrong, but murder, and they hoped the hotel's CCTV footage would help with their inquiries.
Two detectives viewed the CCTV footage from the hotel.
Armed with the details of all the Croydon family vehicles, 20 minutes after Philip had checked in, police made a surprising discovery.
Mrs. Croydon's car was seen entering the hotel on the Friday evening, and a lady who got out of the car fitted the description of Mrs. Croydon. That was clearly very irregular to what she'd said to us about where she was the night before and the fact that her husband was out playing cards.
Then officers saw Carol leaving in different clothes 40 minutes later.
The two officers spoke to the senior investigating officer and immediately then went to Edwinstowe, saw Miss Croydon, and she was arrested on suspicion of murder.
The family liaison officer, Matt Spradbury, was there to see the reaction to this new turn of events.
It was a massive shock to the family that she'd been arrested on suspicion of his murder.
I couldn't believe it. I said, look, you've got to be wrong, this can't be right. You've made a mistake. I just couldn't believe that she'd done it.
All the police activity outside the Croydon house in Edwinstowe started to attract attention in the village.
So the village of Edwinstowe is a very nice, quaint, leafy village, very close to Sherwood Forest. It's a lovely place to live, and for journalists there was a massive interest, and for us we obviously covered it every single day.
Carol Croydon was taken to Wigston police station in Leicester to explain how she happened to be checking into the same hotel as the husband she had reported missing.
The police obviously looked into her story, and they looked at the CCTV from the hotel, and there was Carol Croydon at the hotel. Apparently she had no knowledge that her husband was there, and she was going to see him, and she was also filmed leaving the hotel. Police could then prove that she did know where he had been.
She was obviously aware that officers had got her going into the hotel on CCTV. She told police officers that she'd gone there to meet her husband to engage in a swingers session with another couple who were called Brian and Linda.
Whilst Carol was being interviewed in custody, the family wanted as many updates as possible and were waiting eagerly to find out whether there were going to be any charges against her. I had contact with Philip's brother Stephen in the main, and he was adamant that I made a personal visit to them to keep them updated no matter what time it was.
Carol Croydon said that she left the hotel room, she left Brian and Linda in the hotel room with her husband, and that she'd lost her nerve and gone.
This didn't sit right with me at all because Phil just isn't like that. Never would have even entered his mind to do anything like that.
Phil was very quiet and very shy, and certainly that was totally out of character. So then that made me think, what has she done?
The police went on the hunt for Brian and Linda, the swingers from room 328.
Whilst Mrs. Croydon was being interviewed, officers were checking the CCTV footage of the hotel. There was no evidence whatsoever of anyone else going into the room where Mr. Croydon was found. So it soon became very apparent to officers on the investigation that Mrs. Croydon was telling us a lie.
Whilst the family tried to come to terms with events, and after the police had failed to find Brian and Linda on the hotel CCTV, they expanded their investigation to Carol's house in Edwinstowe.
Mrs. Croydon was in custody. There's a lot of actions that are going on behind the scene. We have a lot of detectives who are working on this case.
3 days after Philip's death, the police made a discovery.
Officers carried out a forensic search of her home address and found in a dustbin a carrier bag which contained blood marks, which subsequently, upon testing, turned out to be the blood of Mr. Croydon.
The police continued their search, uncovering plane tickets to Dublin for Carol and a male passenger flying 2 days after Philip's death. With this new evidence, they questioned Carol again.
She was asked about a number of contacts that were held in a mobile phone. There was a gentleman in the contacts that she described as being a friend and a shoulder to cry on. However, behind the scenes, officers were making inquiries into the various individuals concerned, and this particular individual, it soon became apparent from what officers found that he was more than just a casual friend, if you like, and possibly somebody that she may have been having some sort of relationship with.
It wasn't long before Carol changed her story.
When she was further interviewed, she introduced this person to us as somebody that she was having a relationship with. Mrs. Croydon told police officers that her boyfriend had come to the hotel, come into the room, and told her to leave, later meeting up with him in the evening. He then told her that she wouldn't be seeing her husband again.
Police acted fast, and Carol's lover was arrested.
The following interview, she then actually changed her story and actually said to police officers that her boyfriend burst into the hotel room and stabbed her husband Philip several times, and she actually witnessed him do that. So we've got a change, if you like, of the two interviews, from actually letting him in and asking him to leave to, secondly, from actually watching him do it. She was asked, how did her boyfriend get into the room? How did he burst into the room? She was unable to answer that.
Could it be that Carol is so enmeshed with her lover? Is she wanting to protect him? Is she covering for him? And would that explain why actually the stories so far really haven't been very believable at all?
While Carol's lover was in custody, the police were checking out his movements at the time of the murder.
We're able to actually eliminate her boyfriend through his mobile phone, which actually put him in a different part of the country, and he couldn't possibly have been anywhere near the incident scene.
The police looked into his story very carefully to discount him from the murder, and they proved that it would have been impossible for the lover to get to the hotel in time and leave. They retraced his route very carefully, they timed it, and they made it sure that they could prove that he was not involved.
Philip's family continued to be kept informed of events by police.
It was like as if Phil had died all over again, because the first story obviously wasn't true. So then she was telling us this. So then it was like putting us through that torture of losing Phil all over again, but in a different way.
Once we discovered that the boyfriend could not possibly have been involved with the murder, he was released from custody. We then presented the evidence that we'd got so far to the CPS, who proposed that we charge Mrs. Croydon with murder.
After 13 separate interviews, and 5 days since Philip Croydon's body was discovered in room 328, his wife Carol was charged with murder.
There was sort of a sense of relief there that, we knew what had happened.
News of the murder charge against Carol quickly spread through the community.
When the villagers found out, they were shocked, because it's such a quiet, peaceful village. Everybody were talking about it at that time, because it was so unusual.
Police started to build a picture of the days leading up to Philip Croydon's death. But to establish murder, they would have to prove Carol had a motive.
We made inquiries at Carol Croydon's place of work, and CCTV showed that she left at 2 minutes to 5. She'd actually signed out at 20 past 5. We thought that showed some sort of planning on her behalf to buy herself some 20 minutes of time.
With Carol in custody, the police continued with their investigation.
We made inquiries at Carol Croydon's place of work, and it became apparent that there was a knife missing, some sort of cheese knife, but we were never able to fully establish the time it went missing.
On the morning of the 25th of April 2003, police believed Carol left home for work with a number of neckties and a change of clothes in her possession. Had Carol set out that day with murder on her mind? The case was building, but who knew what was around the corner? In Nottinghamshire, police were dealing with a murder investigation that was continually changing direction, but they were determined to find the truth. 5 days after Philip Croydon had been found stabbed in a hotel room near the village of Edwinstowe, his wife Carol had been charged with his murder. She'd already changed her story on 3 occasions, wasting police time and resources, but there was more to come. Whilst Carol was on remand awaiting trial, yet another version of events emerged. She now said Philip had asked her to tie him up.
As a child, she'd been sexually abused by various people. She said that she'd had flashbacks to her childhood, which caused her to inflict the stab wounds to her husband, which subsequently killed Mr. Croydon.
At this stage, it's quite clear that Carol has committed the killing, so really the only other option for her is to try and get a reduced sentence by saying that it was diminished responsibility.
Carol blamed flashbacks to her childhood, and that had sent her into a blind rage, and she couldn't remember doing anything, but just found herself standing over Phil's body, and Phil was dead.
I've worked with a lot of patients who have flashback phenomenon, and they are very strong, vivid memories. What tends to happen, though, is that people go back to how they felt whilst that memory was formed. So what I would expect was for Carol to have felt small, helpless, immobilised with fear.
With Carol now claiming she hadn't committed murder, it was the police's job to prove it was premeditated. So they looked into Carol and Philip's life together in the search for a motive.
Carol's past was always kind kind of kept a bit of not a secret, but she never wanted to discuss it. And if you asked her questions about her past, which you could tell made her feel uncomfortable, she would move on to another subject.
Philip Croydon and Carol got married on the 17th of June 2000 at St Peter's Church in the Derby suburb of Chellaston.
Her first impressions were good. I mean, Phil's obviously clearly madly in love with her, even though he'd not known her for very long. Carol seemed very friendly, but she was a little bit secretive about her past and her family. We knew she'd been adopted, she told us that much, but that was about all she did tell us.
Philip's father told me during my interview with him that he didn't know very much about Carol's background or much about her, and he potentially wasn't too trusting with her.
Phil kind of changed a little bit. I got the feeling that she was feeding him, this is what you should do, this is what you should say.
Police discovered that Philip went out of his way to try and give Carol everything she desired.
She was very materialistic. Everything with Carol was all about money, and how people might perceive her, down to the car that she had, the pedigree cats that she had. Everything was all about how it looked to other people.
This was also noted by Family Liaison Officer Matt Spradbury.
They both had, at the time, brand new Toyota sports vehicles. The home address was beautifully furnished and a very nice big house. It's quite clear that Carol liked to have nice clothes as well from some of the search work we did, and liked to have nice things in her life.
The investigation continued, and officers uncovered that Carol's lavish lifestyle with Philip was in stark contrast to her upbringing.
There's no doubt that Carol had not come from ideal circumstances. That leads me to think that maybe she'd inherited some sort of predisposition towards antisocial behaviour. Or at the very least, maybe her early experiences in those first 2 years of when she was still with her mother and her father were so damaging that it affected her ability to form close, meaningful attachments to people in her life, and particularly men in her life.
Philip's family may have been unaware of Carol's background, but they were now under no illusions that she had killed Philip.
The police had just drip-fed us the information as time had gone on, and each time she'd changed the story. I think it wasn't a shock what she'd done, because we knew a different person to the person that she was portraying.
When the pathology report came back, it didn't seem to point to a vulnerable woman who was protecting herself as she was claiming.
Carol entered room 328, where her husband was waiting. She performed a sex act on her husband, and then she got a 4-inch cheese knife out of her bag and began to stab him.
On examination of Mr. Croydon, found that he'd been stabbed 22 occasions, 2 to the chest, 20 to the neck area.
Philip Croydon bled to death. He had superficial cuts to his left hand that implied that he'd tried to grasp the blade as it was plunged into him, and that he'd possibly been trying to fight back to save his life.
The attack was very frenzied, but then it had to be in order to get Philip dead quickly so that he couldn't overpower her, maybe use the knife against her in self-defence. So she had to be committed to a very, very brutal and sudden attack. And she was. She severed his spinal cord with one blow, so she wasn't taking any chances.
This horrific attack on Philip had been carried out with a cheese knife that fitted the description of one that had gone missing from Carol's workplace a few weeks before.
Here we've got a direct link between Carol and the murder weapon. Now, I can imagine why somebody planning a night of romps with a husband might pack neckties and scarves, but pack a cheese knife? That's something that's a bit more difficult to explain.
With Carol's stories not adding up, Ascertaining what was fact and what was fiction in Carol Croydon's life wasn't proving to be simple for police. Carol Croydon was accused of murdering her husband Philip and leaving him tied up in a Nottinghamshire hotel room, trying to make it look like a bondage session gone wrong. Having already changed her story numerous times, Carol was now claiming diminished responsibility due to a life of abuse. Police were still busy trying to prove a motive, and thus murder.
There just seemed to be no motive whatsoever for killing her husband, except that she stood to inherit the £300,000 family home in Edwinstowe and an insurance policy.
Police carried on with their investigations and went through the hotel bookings on the night of the killing.
A neighbouring couple who were in the next room to Mr. Croydon reported hearing noises at the relevant time of the incident and a voice saying, "Don't, don't."
Officers continued trying to prove that Carol's motive was financial. Looking into her and Philip's relationship was key to their case.
He met Carol at work. Carol went there as an accountant, and after a short period of time they developed problems with the company. Carol was fired from her position. Phil was that much in love with her. He felt that he had to give his notice in as well, so they both went at the same time.
Detectives soon discovered a side to Carol that she'd kept hidden from everyone, including her besotted husband.
She'd made a lot of false statements, if you like. She'd got a false driving licence in terms of her date of birth. Her birth certificate had been falsified, again with the date of birth. Her passport, even a national insurance number. She'd made herself appear 4 years younger than what she actually was. She was also, it was found that she'd applied for an accountancy course and falsified her qualifications. That enabled her to get a role later on in life as an accountant. Clearly, there's a lot of things going on in the background here that just didn't add up with Mrs. Croydon.
What police were discovering was that Carol Croydon's whole life was nothing more than a tangled web of lies. What they needed to do was prove that her claim of diminished responsibility was just another one.
Carol said that she'd been abused, sexually abused, physically abused throughout her life and by various different men. It might provide some sort of reason for why she's so willing to really take advantage of any of the men in her life, and why she was angry towards her partner to the extent that actually divorcing him wasn't enough. She wanted to kill him.
After an investigation lasting more than 6 months, the police believed they had enough evidence to convict Carol of murder. But it would all be meaningless if her defence could prove diminished responsibility. On January the 28th, 2004, the case against Carol Croydon went to Nottingham Crown Court.
She was brought into court, sat in the dock, very calmly. As all the charges were read out to the jury. There was one charge, obviously, was murder. I just remember her being very, very calm and cool in the circumstances. She was facing a murder charge.
The prosecution presented their case, witnesses came and gave their evidence. The defence went down the line of provocation. Mrs. Croydon was suggesting that her childhood she'd suffered sexual abuse by a number of people and that she'd suffered provocation into murdering her husband.
The whole of Philip's family were in court from the first day.
Carol didn't show any emotion. When she stood there was just a look of fear, but not any emotion showing at all. It was just like shock that she'd been caught.
The extent of Carol's colossal amount of lying was laid out in every detail for the jury.
There's only one witness to the crime, obviously, which was Carol Croydon. and she didn't give evidence about that. So the jury were reliant on the explanations that she gave to the police at the time, and there were varying explanations as to what happened and what her involvement was that changed. And that was probably one of the most interesting parts of the case, about how she had told lie after lie to the point where she couldn't remember what happened.
To be a good liar, you have to construct a very plausible lie, and then you have to stick to it really quite rigidly. And this is where she comes unstuck, because Carol has to have points for flair and imagination, but when it comes to consistency and believability, she really does fall down. She's too much of a fantasist.
The jury then heard Carol's final version of events.
Mrs. Croydon had admitted that she'd stabbed her husband many, many times, but she'd had a blackout, and that when she came to, she was just standing over his body and couldn't actually recall the actual incident itself. This was viewed by a psychiatrist in court as being very unusual in circumstances. He said it was possible, but he doubted it. She's fitted each account to try and deceive, and hopefully she was hoping to get away with convincing people, but obviously when she's presented with the truth, she has to change her story.
The prosecution introduced the evidence from the crime scene, starting with the pathology report.
The pathologist in court found the neckties around his wrists had not been soaked in blood, which implied that it had been tied around his wrists after he'd been attacked.
What the chambermaid saw would have appeared to a layperson as a sexual misadventure, a sexually motivated offence. But actually, it doesn't take too close an inspection to work out that it's not all as it seems. And when a crime scene has been cleverly constructed to look like something it isn't, there's a reason for that. Somebody wants to distance themselves. So if somebody wants to distance themselves from a murder, the chances are that they're actually very, very close. And you can't be more close to this murder than a husband and a wife.
Sitting in court, Carol's web of lies were harrowing for Philip's loved ones.
We all went every day for nearly 3 weeks. Some days it was difficult. You know, you didn't want to get in the car, you didn't want to go and listen to the information that you knew you were going to have to sit through again, and kind of see my mum and dad's faces and how everybody felt, and it was very upsetting and very draining, and obviously something that took the family years and years to get over, and I really don't think my dad ever got over it.
Towards the end of the trial, the prosecution called in a psychologist to talk about Carol's alleged state of mind at the time of the killing.
Carol says that she was very, very depressed. She was depressed as a result of problems in her marriage, and she was depressed as a result of trauma in her history. But the classic symptoms of depression are lack of libido, lack of motivation, lack of concentration and ability to plan ahead, general purpose apathy. Now that's actually the antithesis of what we're seeing with Carol, because this is somebody who was able to plan and execute a murder and also maintain several affairs.
What the jury was told by the expert witness was to be key in the case against Carol Croydon.
It's concluded that Mrs. Croydon couldn't have been suffering from any mental disability or depression at the time of the killing.
With that, Carol Croydon's defence of diminished responsibility collapsed. It was the moment Philip's family had been waiting for.
At this point during the trial, they were now beginning to think, she's responsible for this, and they just wanted justice to be done.
After almost a 3-week trial, a jury of 7 women and 5 men retired to consider Carol Croydon's various accounts of the events on the evening of the 25th of April 2003. After just 3 hours, they'd reached a verdict.
On February 12, 2004, Carol Croydon was convicted of the murder of her husband at Nottingham Crown Court. She broke down uncontrollably in the dock when the jury came back with the verdict. She clutched a tissue to her head.
I think when the judge found her guilty, I'm sure I screamed. It was panic. I was thankful that she'd been found guilty, but at the same time, still kind of just thinking about Phil and what, we were never going to see him again.
On convicting Mrs. Croydon, the judge said in his summing up that he was quite satisfied that she'd committed a sex act on him, got him at his weakest point, and it was at that point that she murdered him.
The judge sentenced Carol to life imprisonment set at a minimum term of 16 years. He told her that she was a cold-hearted, cold-blooded killer who tried to blame others for being responsible for her husband's murder.
This Carol Croydon case wasn't a sudden loss of self-control during an argument. It was a pre-planned and well thought out murder.
All along, Carol's allegations of abuse had just been more lies. Philip's family struggled to see the 16-year sentence as justice.
The sentence can never be long enough for anyone to do something like that, to take another life deliberately and never show any remorse, which she hasn't. She's never ever admitted to it, never shown any remorse, never apologised. And to do something like that, my opinion is people who are 100% guilty, there's no doubt whatsoever, they should stay in prison the rest of their life.
When she was found guilty, she sat in the dock and she sobbed, presumably for the fact that she wouldn't be able to live the great life that she'd led in the past, not for the fact of she'd taken our brother away from us, and she killed him in such a horrible way that would be emblazoned on all our minds forever.
After the verdict, Philip's dad, Ted Croydon, read a statement in which he said, "I curse this woman every day I wake. I call on God that she cannot sleep, that she knows no peace of mind, that her food is harsh in her mouth and without taste, that her thirst cannot be quenched, that she sees no sun or the beauty of nature, that she hears no bird song." He added, "That woman is the devil incarnate, nothing but an evil witch."
I absolutely hate her as much as I did the day that she did it. I hate her just as much, not just for what she did to Phil, but what she's put my family through. It's unforgivable. My father was never the same. It ruined his life. It changed him completely. He was a broken man. He died a broken man. I'll never ever forgive her for that.
Because Carol Croydon refused to take the stand, no one will ever know for certain what happened in room 328 on the 25th of April 2003. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the whole case is that Carol's lover left his wife, and at time of sentencing still wanted a future with her, despite the fact that she named him as the killer, hoping to evade justice.
Clock in for startling footage exposing the reality of frontline policing Saturday at 9 in Brickham. Emergency on our streets.
Could identify who had made those bite marks was another way of identifying who had carried out the murder.
You just couldn't take it in, because something like that doesn't happen to you, and especially in Dereham.
He had no remorse, he's just pure evil.
In April 2008, an ambulance was called to a flat in Dereham, where the paramedics found the body of a woman with stab wounds and bite marks to her face and chin. What began as a simple murder case turned into one of the most challenging investigations that Norfolk police had ever dealt with. Situated halfway between Norwich and King's Lynn is the town of Dereham, home to 47-year-old mother of three, Elaine Walpole. On Tuesday, the 29th of April 2008, a friend raised the alarm after not seeing Elaine for a few days.
Elaine's neighbour hadn't seen Elaine since the Saturday. They used to see each other every day, and so he was concerned that she may have fallen and had some sort of medical episode in her flat, and called an ambulance.
Paramedics had forced their way into the property, where they saw Elaine dead on the floor. DCI Fry of Norfolk Police's major investigation team took over the case the following day and went straight to the flat.
The scene was really quite chaotic. There were smashed plates and things strewn all over the floor. Some of the contents of drawers that had been pulled out and the fronts broken off. It was really very untidy.
DCI Fry needed to quickly establish what had gone on.
It was a case of door-to-door inquiries. Intelligence needed to be gathered around what we knew about Elaine, what we knew about any of her family and friends. Anything that had been happening in that particular area of Dereham. Had there been a spate of burglaries going on that she might have disturbed someone? Just a general gathering of intelligence that may assist the inquiry.
While police were making inquiries, the forensic team at the crime scene were building up a picture of events leading up to Elaine's murder.
The state of the crime scene, to me, does suggest that there was some sort of altercation, fight, argument. But it does seem to go beyond what would have occurred just as a result of a struggle. The whole thing really seems to speak of somebody who was very angry, maybe seeking to intimidate and dominate, and really maybe demonstrate power and control.
The residents of peaceful and picturesque Dereham were oblivious to what had happened.
Dereham is a good place to live. It's at the very heart of one of the loveliest counties in the country, Norfolk. So it's surrounded by beautiful countryside. And it's a place where you can get to know people and be known.
Dereham is a fairly tight-knit community. Everybody gets on with everybody, I think. Quite a lot of us know what everybody else is doing. Not always for the good. But generally, yeah, it's a pretty good community spirit around Dereham. People look after each other.
Police quickly established that Elaine had family living locally. Unfortunately, they were about to receive some devastating news.
I was at home with my children when I got a phone call to say my mum had died. It didn't seem real. I just felt numb. After I got the phone call, I phoned my sister. She was at work.
My sister called my manager and asked me to call her back immediately. It was really urgent. At that time, I didn't know what was going on, so I called my sister as quickly as I could. She told me that Mum had died, and that's all we knew. We didn't know how, we didn't know when, we didn't know why. We just knew that she was dead.
I first heard of my sister's death in the bank in Dereham. Everything was going through my head because you don't want to believe it.
We all went round to my Auntie Jackie's to see if anyone could shed any light on what had happened, because at that point no one told us anything. The police didn't tell us anything. No one told us what was going on. We sort of had to use our imagination, I guess, and try and work out what had happened. So that was quite difficult.
Until a post-mortem was carried out, police couldn't be certain about Elaine's cause of death. All they had to go on so far was what they had found at the scene.
Elaine lay with her head in the kitchen, and there's a pool of blood around her head. She was naked from the waist down, and she'd several stab wounds, including one that went through her neck. There were some what looked like perfectly round circular marks, one on her right cheek and one on her chin. And initially I thought possibly she'd been hit with the bottom of a beer bottle with that slight stippling.
Police needed to identify the mystery marks, a clue that could lead to the killer.
I've been to probably between 50 and 70 scenes where there has been an unexplained or suspicious death, and they can be extremely upsetting, but you focus on the job and really put it out of your mind, because there's a job to do. Initially, with the examination of the scene, it was unclear how Elaine had died. It was rated as an unexplained death. The following morning, when the post-mortem examination results came through, which showed that she had 3 stab wounds and about 50 other injuries, including the 2 unexplained injuries on her cheek and her chin, I upgraded it to suspicious death.
Suspicious death was a term police used for probable murder. It was time to share this news with her family.
When we found out that my mum had been stabbed, me and my family, we just couldn't believe it. We were shocked. Couldn't believe it at all.
Devastated, shocked. I was just unreal, really. You just couldn't take it in, because something like that doesn't happen to you, and especially in Dereham. We were just, totally in shock.
The investigation team needed to look further into evidence found at the crime scene for clues that would lead them to Elaine's killer.
A knife was found on an arm of the sofa near to where Elaine lay that was identified as the knife that had been used to stab her. There was a broken bottle on the floor in the lounge that revealed a fingerprint. There were some boxer shorts still on the floor there, and a receipt from where she'd been to the shop the previous Saturday. That led to an inquiry to go and find out what she'd bought. And then that shop had CCTV, so we looked at securing that CCTV and looking through that to see if she was with anyone or if there was anything of value to be gained from there.
Accessing the shop's CCTV footage and identifying the fingerprint would take a while, so the police looked further into Elaine's life.
Elaine had a son and 2 daughters. All of them lived in the Dereham area. Clearly a close bond between them, and she obviously looked forward to their visits.
Elaine was born in Hackney in London in 1960 and moved to Dereham aged 19 in the late 70s.
She got told she couldn't have children, but later on she found out that she was due to have twins, and obviously she was ecstatic, really. We was all happy for her. And then she had twin girls, and then she went on to have a little boy.
I used to go and visit my mum every Friday with my nan and my children, and on the Friday before she died, she was laughing around with the children, dancing and singing with them. My mum was quite a private person. She didn't have many friends. One of her friends was her neighbour, and he used to visit her as well.
Essentially, she lived quite an isolated life. Her family visited her regularly, and she had a routine of going to the shop every day and then returning home and spending most of the day on her own or in the company of a neighbour or whatever in her own flat.
It was clear to police that the person who saw Elaine most regularly was the neighbour that had reported her missing.
When we first found out what had happened to Mum, we all assumed it was her neighbour because she'd had run-ins with him in the past. So we all automatically assumed it was him.
A planned arrest was made on the neighbour to try to either eliminate him from the investigation or see whether he was actually responsible. That gave the opportunity to do a proper search of his flat, recover his clothing to see if there was any transfer of bodily fluids. Having arrested the neighbour, he was interviewed and he was able to give an account of his movements from the last sighting of Elaine right through till the Tuesday, which we followed up on. And it was clear within a few hours that it was unlikely that he was actually involved in her murder, and therefore he was bailed so that we could focus our resources elsewhere.
One day into the inquiry, it was clear that Elaine Walpole's neighbour was innocent, leaving the police with no suspects. Without a concrete lead, finding her killer was some way off. Police were investigating the death of 47-year-old Elaine Walpole, found stabbed to death in her home in April 2008. They believed it was murder, and news of the crime had spread in the normally safe town of Dereham.
The time of Elaine's murder, I was running a pub just up the road, just a few minutes walk away from the flats that she was killed in. It was a big shock to everybody. Things like that don't seem to happen around here. It was a shock.
Dereham is a very low crime area. There's no doubt about that. The statistics prove it. And so when something like this happens, we can't come to terms with it very easily, and there's this element of unknown and what's happened and just basic shock.
That was on the news, in the paper, on the radio. Everywhere you sort of went, there was everybody talking about it, so you couldn't really keep it private. I used to hold my head down sometimes in town when I went in town, because I thought, oh God, who's looking at me now? Because I felt like everybody was looking at you.
The police were waiting on forensic tests from the crime scene, and before long, results started to filter through.
After 2 days, the fingerprint from the bottle in the lounge was identified, and it was shown to be that from a young man called Juvenile Ferreira.
Records stated that Juvenile Ferreira was a 16-year-old boy from the Gambia.
The problem was the fingerprint was on a bottle which is a movable item, and therefore conceivably he may have been into a shop, picked a bottle up, put it back down again, then Elaine gone in later, selected the bottle and taken it back to her flat. So the fact that his fingerprint was in her flat was interesting, but the fact that it was on a movable item meant that I couldn't call him a suspect at that stage.
Police had also discovered a shop receipt from 3 days before Elaine's body was found, and had been waiting for access to the corresponding CCTV.
The receipt found in Elaine's lounge identified a purchase in a local shop at around about 4 o'clock this afternoon, and by looking at the CCTV we identified that she was in the shop with Juvenile Ferreira. A clear image of him on the CCTV, facially and from behind, clearly with Elaine, selecting some alcohol and then leaving with her. So with the images of Ferreira in the shop and the fingerprint in Elaine's flat, he was obviously becoming of greater interest, but not necessarily enough to be technically called a suspect.
It was time to investigate Juvenile Ferreira further.
Police National Computer is a tool that police officers use every day. If they suspect a car to have been stolen, they will check that on the computer. If they stop someone for some reason, they will check on the Police National Computer. If that person's wanted, it will be logged on there, and their criminal history is also logged on the computer, so they will know what those sort of people have been up to.
Ferreira was showing up on the Police National Computer as having been arrested a few hours after he was spotted on the shop's CCTV footage with Elaine.
Ferreira had initially acted quite strangely in the memorial gardens around lunchtime on the Saturday, where there were some people taking photographs, etc., and he'd acted a little strangely towards a lady there. He'd then gone to a garage sale on the Norwich Road, somewhere between the shop where he'd been seen with Elaine and Elaine's home address, and he was at the garage sale there, and again quite upset one of the ladies there, and was asked to leave. Also around that time, it would appear that he met up with a young lad on a nearby road, asked to borrow his bicycle and rode off on it. That bicycle was found in Elaine's flat.
After stealing the bike, Juvenile Ferreira was spotted at around 4 p.m. on the CCTV with Elaine, and he continued to cause disturbances in Dereham that evening.
He went into the centre of town, where his behaviour became quite odd. He was leering through a window at a young girl there. He lay on the bonnet of a car and was acting very strangely. Several different young couples were concerned at the way he was behaving. And then he went into a supermarket, grabbed, I think, a bottle of wine and ran out of the supermarket. And it was as he was running away, he was rugby tackled to the ground by a member of the public who happened to be someone from a nearby army base. The police arrested Ferreira and took him to the police station, where he was found to be really quite inebriated, unfit for interview, and so he was searched and put into a cell overnight. He was found to have no underwear on, but he was basically laid down for the night to sober up, and then he was interviewed the following morning about the theft from the supermarket and his conduct in the centre of Dereham. Before Ferreira's release, Ferreira's fingerprints and DNA were taken.
2 days later, Elaine's dead body had been found.
At that point, we didn't know exactly when Elaine had died. We didn't know that Ferreira was actually responsible for that. We knew he was involved in this fracas in Dereham, but there were still many questions left to be answered and a lot of detail to be found.
Police now knew Ferreira had been acting strangely around the time of Elaine's murder, and that he was one of the last people to have seen her alive. But they needed more concrete evidence.
The next big step forward was a DNA hit. Swabs taken from Elaine's body had been sent to the forensic laboratory, and semen from Juvenile Ferreira was found on those swabs. A clear link between the incident and Juvenile Ferreira, and he was now a suspect.
Elaine and Ferreira were from different walks of life, but the bodily fluids indicated she'd had sexual contact with this 16-year-old boy. It was the evidence the police had been waiting for.
So now we had DNA from Ferreira on Elaine, and putting that together with the fingerprint, the CCTV image of her with him, he became the main suspect, and he was put on the police national computer as a wanted person.
Juvenile Ferreira's elevated status meant that all UK police forces were on red alert, ready to seize him should they come into contact with him.
Almost simultaneously to the DNA hit coming through, we received a phone call from Hertfordshire Police. They had stopped Juvenile Ferreira in Hoddesdon, and I was able to tell them to arrest him and take him back to the police station.
Back at the station, police began to piece together his movements, after causing mayhem in Norfolk 11 days earlier.
Having been released from the police station in Dereham, he'd returned home, and then the following morning he'd made his way to London, where he'd tried to get on to the Eurostar.
Just a day after he was seen with Elaine, Ferreira had tried to flee the country.
He wasn't allowed to get on because his papers only allowed him entry to the UK and not to the Eurozone as a whole. And he then made his way to Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire.
In Hertfordshire, Ferreira had shoplifted, got into fights and robbed people, revealing a picture of a youth out of control. He had been in and out of police custody beginning on Saturday the 26th of April, the day of Elaine Walpole's suspected murder. Finally, the net was closing in on the police's prime suspect in Elaine Walpole's horrific murder. In Norfolk, all the evidence in Elaine Walpole's murder was pointing to one man, and the police were desperate to talk to him. Elaine had been found naked from the waist down, with multiple injuries, and Juvenile Ferreira, aged 16, was the young man police had arrested for her murder, but not yet charged.
Following Ferreira's arrest, I arranged for a search of his home address to be carried out, and in his bedroom, several items that linked him to Elaine's murder were found. A purse belonging to Elaine was found there, a SIM card and a phone, and there was a pair of boots with a blood stain on it, and that was later found to be Elaine's blood. He was represented in the interviews and basically said very little. I remember the interviewing sergeant saying to me that he was very surprised. Ferreira seemed a lot older. But we carried on with the interviews. He said very little, and then gradually, as we gathered all the different evidence together, the property found, there was his DNA, I was in a position to approach the CPS and ask to charge him with murder.
The CPS agreed, and on the 10th of May 2008, 11 days after Elaine Walpole's body had been found, Juvenile Ferreira was charged.
Juvenile Ferreira was charged with murder, but as a juvenile, he had to be treated differently. He was kept in a different prison, and if convicted, would be subject to a different term of imprisonment. Roughly a third of that he'd be expected as an adult.
Well, when we got told by the police that they'd caught someone, obviously we were, I don't know, we were sort of like, your mind's all over the place, because obviously you're happy that someone's been caught, but obviously we wanted to know who it was and why. So obviously it was all in sort of like mixed emotions, really.
Ferreira was held on remand at Feltham Young Offenders Institute while police continued investigating him, discovering that he'd moved to Durham from the Gambia in 2007. But confirming Ferreira's age was proving to be difficult.
We still had our suspicions that Ferreira was older than he was actually saying. Inquiries in the Gambia with the Attorney General indicated that travel documents could be obtained just by saying what your date of birth is without any evidence, and therefore they weren't a real true reflection of someone's date of birth. Ferreira's mother, who had moved to England, wanted to take him from the Gambia back to England, and therefore had applied for his travel documents stating a date of birth that made him at that time under 16 and a dependent. The Attorney General on my behalf made inquiries at the school where Ferreira had been and obtained his school certificate, but because he'd moved from Guinea-Bissau, where he was born, to the Gambia, we couldn't be absolutely sure when he'd started his school, and therefore that wasn't evidence of his birth and his age.
Not being able to clarify Ferreira's age was a blow, but the police still had work to do in preparation for the trial, so focused on his relationship with Elaine.
We wanted to know how Ferreira met Elaine, how well he knew her, and from inquiries it appeared that Ferreira was refused to purchase either alcohol or cigarettes in the shop and had gone outside and then asked Elaine to buy something for him, then returned into the shop and then walked away from the shop in the direction of her home address with her. As far as we know, that was the first time he had met Elaine.
Ferreira's semen was found on Elaine's dead body, pointing to sexual contact between them. But to add sexual assault to the existing murder charge, DCI Fry had to disprove consensual sex. Police needed to find out more about Elaine's personal life, and they returned to the family.
Elaine would always tell you stuff, even if you didn't want to know about it, she'd soon tell you about things. So, yeah, she'd definitely tell you if she had a boyfriend.
I'd never heard of him. She'd never mentioned him to any of us, so we were very shocked that she would be involved with someone so young. We didn't know anything about him, or why they would even come to be acquaintances in the first place.
As far as her family were concerned, Elaine wasn't in a relationship with anyone at the time of her death, let alone a random 16-year-old boy. The suggestion was upsetting, and more distressing was that they still hadn't been able to lay Elaine to rest.
One thing that the family found very difficult to deal with was the delay in being able to hold Elaine's funeral. The problem is that we hold our post-mortem as soon as we can, but the defence have the right to hold their own post-mortem so that they can check the evidence that we've obtained. And therefore we have to have caught someone, charged them, and then given the defence the opportunity to carry out their own post-mortem. And in this case, the defence delayed and the post-mortem wasn't carried out for several months.
Having the funeral after 4 months, it was obviously a huge weight had lifted off our shoulders that we were able to have the funeral. But we knew that the trial was coming up, so we still had that to deal with. So we were still all really anxious and worried about the outcome of the trial.
Unfortunately for Elaine's family, a new development at Feltham Young Offenders Institute suggested Ferreira wasn't going down without a fight.
Whilst we were preparing the case, we were contacted by the prison where Ferreira was being kept, and we were told that he had written on the wall of his cell, "I didn't kill her, she was my girlfriend, for goodness sake, I'm only a kid." This gave an indication of the defence that Ferreira may be putting forward at court, that he knew Elaine, that she was his girlfriend, and it's quite common for people to remain sort of denying the offence right through the system.
Graffiti more commonly is a way in which individuals make a statement about themselves to the world. It's how they want to be seen. Now, that might have a tactical element in that he's trying to influence people's views of his culpability, but it could be that he's trying to convince himself, because some sexual murderers don't like admitting even to themselves what they've done.
Police now had to prove that Elaine and Ferreira were not in a relationship as he claimed, and that a violent sexual assault had taken place. They went back to the evidence from the crime scene.
A big conundrum was the injury to Elaine's face, to her cheek and her chin. It looked like a circle of identical marks, if you like. Could it have been the bottom of a bottle? Could it have been a pill packet in someone's hand as they struck her on the face? What had caused those marks? So I contacted the National Injuries Database for their expert opinion, and they said to me that it's a possibility that it was bite marks. They provided me with several experts, and I decided to contact forensic odontologist Freddie Martin.
It was now turning into an incredibly complex investigation for Norfolk Police, needing to call on a forensic odontologist, otherwise known as a forensic dentist, to help them out.
Forensic odontology is extremely useful to police and prosecutors. On the crime side, it's not uncommon in murder cases for the perpetrator of the murder to bite their victims. And they might bite them extremely viciously as well. Sometimes they're very vicious biting. And in rape cases, for instance, it's very common to find bite marks. And by examining the bite, photographing it, taking impressions from suspects and that sort of thing, it is often possible to match up the perpetrator with the victim.
I sent Freddie photographs of the injuries, and after careful consideration, he was willing to give his expert opinion that they were bite marks. This was exciting because if we could identify who had made those bite marks, it was another way of identifying who had carried out the murder, but also it helped towards boxing off any defence as to consensual sex.
DCI Fry needed to prove these bite marks belonged to juvenile Ferreira to charge him with sexual assault as well as murder. The police also needed to prove their suspicions that he was over 18. But with less than 2 weeks until the trial, the investigation team were running out of time. Police in Dereham had been investigating the death of Elaine Walpole, stabbed to death in her Norfolk home in 2008. They had charged 16-year-old juvenile Ferreira with murder and were keen to add a sexual assault charge after his DNA was found on her body.
So the swabs from Elaine's body were sent as a priority, and other exhibits followed later on. As it happens, the boxer shorts that had been found there, later on, they were found to have Ferreira's DNA on.
With only 2 weeks until the trial, the police had a limited amount of time to prove that bite marks found on Elaine's body had been inflicted by Ferreira.
In order to prove that he had created the bites, we would need teeth impressions, and the problem with that is that they are classed as intimate samples and they can't be taken other than with the consent of the person. And when we approached Ferreira's solicitor, he refused. Without the dental impressions, we couldn't prove that Ferreira had caused those marks on her face. However, we would be able to bring it to the attention of the court that Ferreira had refused, and therefore an adverse inference could be made against Ferreira in the subsequent trial.
This meant the judge could tell the jury that Ferreira had refused to produce the dental impressions, knowing it might hurt his defence.
The solicitor rang CPS on the Thursday before the trial and said that they would give permission, clearly in order to stop any adverse inference being made.
The police had just 1 working day before the trial to get the evidence they needed from juvenile Ferreira.
I rang the odontologist and he said that he'd get onto it straight away. He went to the prison the next day, obtained the teeth impressions, worked on them over the weekend, and by the Monday he had positive proof that the bite marks were made by juvenile Ferreira biting Elaine on her face and on her chin.
The new evidence meant that 16-year-old juvenile Ferreira stood trial charged with both the murder and rape of Elaine Walpole, with the police confident she had never had consensual sex with him.
Throughout the trial, juvenile Ferreira maintained a defence that he was in a relationship with Elaine and that he had consensual sex with her and had left her alive and well on the Saturday and had no knowledge of her murder. This was clearly upsetting for the family, him suggesting that he was in a relationship with her, which they didn't believe at all, and it was really the only way he had to go to try and explain the sexual element to the offence.
We had no idea why they would be associated with each other. They seemingly come from different walks of life. Obviously, my mum was a lot older than him. We don't know why their paths would have crossed.
One can only speculate, but it is possible that he experienced something like a perceived rejection, or that she wouldn't comply, maybe with sexual advances. Perhaps because of the state that he was in with the alcohol, or the emotional state he was in generally. Maybe he was just all too ready to take out his feelings on her.
In his defence, Ferreira claimed that on the Sunday after his release from the police station, he'd returned to Elaine's flat and found her dead. He said that he was shocked by what he saw. He'd moved the knife, he'd got blood on his hands, and he'd washed his hands, and that somehow that's how blood from Elaine had got onto his boot. At some point he claimed that it was possibly a drug dealer that had committed the offence, again upsetting the family. And when he was challenged as to why he hadn't reported what he found to the police, he said that he'd gone to the police station but was too scared to go inside, and so he hadn't reported it. He continued to deny biting Elaine. He continued to deny any violence towards Elaine, but he did admit stealing some of her jewellery.
Having stayed silent in interviews, Ferreira was now claiming he had known Elaine was dead before the police did, but wasn't responsible for the killing.
Going into court and seeing him standing there, the person that killed my mum, was horrible. I made eye contact with him and he stared me out. He had no remorse, he was just pure evil.
DCI Fry felt the prosecution had a strong case against Ferreira, with CCTV, fingerprints and DNA evidence, plus the forensic dentist who took the stand.
Freddie Martin was obviously a key witness, and he came along to provide the evidence that Ferreira had caused the bites on her face. And as we waited outside court, I spoke to Freddie about our problems identifying a real age for Ferreira, and I said to him, it's a pity you can't age someone by their teeth like you can a horse. And Freddie turned to me and said, well, you can.
When you're trying to prove that somebody's over the age of 18, or whether they're under the age of 18, then it is the third molar tooth, the wisdom tooth, that is the one that's going to give you that essential bit of information. You would expect that tooth to start to erupt into the mouth about 16, and 3 years later you would expect the root of that tooth to be fully formed.
This new information was an important breakthrough. If Ferreira had fully formed wisdom teeth, he would be at least 19 years old. But the prosecution and the defence had already given evidence, and the jury were now ready with their verdict.
On the 15th of December 2008, Ferreira was found guilty by a unanimous verdict.
He was convicted of the murder and rape of Elaine Walpole.
When he'd been found guilty, it felt like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders, and finally my mum could have some peace.
It was at this point, if he had been sentenced as a juvenile, he would have got a third of the sentence that he would as an adult. And this was the point where we approached the judge through the barrister to ask for more time to prove Ferreira's true age.
A conviction for murder and rape would have meant just 8 years in prison if Ferreira was sentenced as a juvenile.
After the guilty verdict, we then got told that it would be adjourned until further investigation on his age, and we were relieved that they were actually going to sort out his age and so that he would get the sentence he deserved.
As x-rays of Ferreira's teeth had recently been taken to prove he'd bitten Elaine, the police already had the medical records they needed to analyse.
Freddie Martin, the forensic odontologist, went to work on the x-rays of Ferreira's teeth to try and prove exactly how old he was. The really crushing news was that, in fact, he had a deformity in his teeth, and the last set of molars weren't even there, and he couldn't prove through his teeth how old Ferreira was.
There are certain abnormalities that can occur with the development of the third molar tooth. The roots can become fused. It may have a high degree of a curve on the end of the root. It may not fully form, and then it makes it difficult for the forensic odontologist to actually use that third molar tooth as a method of age assessment of that individual.
The news was terrible, really. We'd really hoped that would be the final thing to show how old he was, and it had been ripped away from us. And we were up against the clock. We had to get some sort of evidence to prove his age before he was due to come back for sentencing. I talked it through with Freddie, and he said, well, there are other ways of proving someone's age. There are different bones in the body that develop at different stages. The wrists, for instance, the bones in the clavicle, through the sternum. But he said he wasn't really the right expert to do that. We needed our own expert, a forensic anthropologist, to give expert evidence as to Ferreira's age through his bones. There was a real problem here because it's so difficult to get someone out of prison for any reason, but to take them to hospital for x-rays is unheard of.
It was another race against time, as police went about trying to arrange further x-rays of Ferreira, now a convicted murderer. Ferreira's defence were also making things difficult for the investigation.
The defence demanded that their expert be present when the x-rays were taken, but the prison said that no one was allowed to know where the procedure would take place beforehand, and therefore we had to arrange for the defence expert to be picked up by police officers and taken to an unknown location to be present as the x-rays were taken. The prison sent him along attached to the biggest prison officer you've ever seen. There was no way that they wanted any chance for him to escape.
X-rays were taken of Ferreira's body, which DCI Fry immediately sent to their forensic anthropologist to analyse.
Julie Roberts was able to say, through the development of the radius of the bones within his wrist, that Ferreira was probably around 21 years old, but at the very least 19. That meant he was an adult. That meant that he would be sentenced as an adult.
On the 27th of March 2009, after an 11-month investigation, juvenile Ferreira went back to court and was sentenced, as an adult, to 22 years imprisonment, roughly 3 times what he would have got as a juvenile.
This was excellent news. Every time we thought that we were getting somewhere, there'd be another block put in the way, and it was a long journey, but this was the end of the road, and we were able to achieve exactly what we set out for.
The police were amazing. They went above and beyond what we ever thought they would do to secure a long sentence for us.
I think everyone was just relieved that after so long we'd finally gotten justice for Mum. Although it won't bring her back, we are happy with the sentencing, and we can just try and move on and obviously never forget her and what happened, but we can cry again.
It still doesn't seem real that my mum's not here anymore. It's just like a nightmare, really. You never think it's going to happen to you as a family, but it's happened to us.
She's too young. She shouldn't be there. She should be here. She should be here with us. We all have a miss her.
Thanks to Norfolk Police's dedication to the pursuit of justice, juvenile Ferreira started a full and just sentence for the murder of mother and grandmother Elaine Walpole that would keep him in jail until what the police believe will be well into his 40s.
Beware the shadows. Who knows what danger lurks? Take the darkest fairy tale and bring it into modern times, weeknights at 10 on Sky Mix. Grimm.
Brutal killings, a massive manhunt, and it shocked the whole town.
The officers went to the 7th floor flat, saw this man holding a sawn-off shotgun. He went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. The press in London called him Spider-Man.
On the night of January the 23rd, 1995, Lancashire police were called to a garage in Morecambe. What they discovered there could have been the scene from a horror film. The investigation into what turned out to be a brutal double murder and the ensuing manhunt for the killer would take the police all over the country. It was a case that the police and the people of Morecambe would never, ever forget. In January 1995, Morecambe, a picturesque seaside town in Lancashire, was about to become front-page news when the dead body of a man was found. DCI Graham Gooch from Lancashire Constabulary was to lead what would become an unprecedented investigation.
On the night in question, I was the duty on-call senior investigating officer, but sound asleep in bed, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone went, which means something awful's happened somewhere. So took the call, and they said they'd had a murder at Morecambe.
The officers had been faced with a gruesome scene at a garage on the Whiteland industrial estate. The dead body had been severely battered.
They tell you basically what's happened, and then you start thinking, what am I going to need? Where shall I rendezvous with the officers on the scene? And start the process rolling.
DCI Colin Mooney was appointed as Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case, an unusual one for this normally quiet holiday resort.
Morecambe's quite a low crime area to live in, particularly compared with other areas of Lancashire. It's got a great beach, and it's got the estuary. There's a famous walk across the Morecambe Bay, a guided walk.
It's not the big razzmatazz of Blackpool, no big rides and things like that. But it has its own lovely appeal. The Queen Mother once came to Morecambe and described Morecambe's view as a $65,000 view.
I would say Morecambe's probably one of the very safest places to live. It's sort of like a bit of a sleepy town. There's not really that much horrendous trouble, you know.
The wives of 49-year-old Tony Morocco and 29-year-old Paul Sandham had phoned the police, worried about their husbands who had worked at the garage together and not returned home.
They were creatures of habit. They'd finish their work about 5 o'clock and go home. And this night, they hadn't. The officers went to the garage with the relatives, and it was locked, and then they found somebody who's got a key to come along and unlock it. So the premises were locked. And inside, then they'd found this scene of destruction. Clearly, it looked as though someone had been playing dodgems with the cars, and there was smashed office furniture, smashed cabinets. And on the floor was the body of Tony Morocco.
Tony's body, unfortunately, bore considerable marks of violence. It looked as though he'd been stabbed and that his head had suffered a number of blows from a blunt instrument.
Well, certainly the amount of violence used was far in excess of that was needed to actually bring about death. There was something very emphatic about it, almost as if the person was acting out, some sense of mission or getting revenge.
From his injuries, it was immediately clear to police that Tony Morocco had been brutally murdered on the premises of his own business. After pathologists had analysed the scene, his body was carefully removed, and along with crime scene investigators, DCI Gooch tried to figure out what had happened.
Left at the scene, there was a lot of blood there. There was a torque wrench, which had blood and traces of body on it and hair, so that appeared to be a fairly obvious murder weapon. And lots of other pieces, because garages are generally fairly messy places, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. But then here we had the feature of this car, this Toyota car, which had obviously crashed into the desk and into the cupboards. So clearly that was part of whatever had happened at the scene. So we knew that we had to do a lot more investigation into that. But of course the first thing on your mind is, who did this?
The police didn't have to look far for their first suspect.
The situation we had was these two men who worked together in the garage. They hadn't come home. We've been along there and we found the body of one of them and the other man's missing. It's not unreasonable to have some suspicion that they'd fallen out and had a terrible argument and that this was the result of it. Because, Paul Sandham was nowhere to be found. He hadn't gone home, which was most unusual.
The police immediately focused on locating Paul Sandham.
Officers had been called out to come to Morecambe to start forming an investigation team. In the morning, those officers had turned up about 8, 9 o'clock, and we'd started the briefing, painting the scene for them to tell them what was going on, what we were going to do, and what each of them would be doing. And then, during that briefing, in came one of the officers saying, "Hang on, boss, I think there's been a development," and hands me a piece of paper saying the body's been found further, just out in the countryside, a little way from Morecambe. And then we found out that that was Paul Sandham, who had been stabbed many, many times.
The man police had been treating as a suspect had been left for dead with 41 knife wounds.
There was a clear connection between the two victims, and also the level of violence used on both of them was quite similar. It did bring into focus the fact that there had been a deliberate separation of the two victims, which, of course, highlighted just how calculated it was.
At this point, then, we realised that we had a double murder on our hands. It was inconceivable that two people who worked so closely together, who went missing at about the same time, and both found murdered, would not be linked.
I've dealt with murders before with more than one victim. They don't come very often, but it does change things completely from what we were looking at before. Before we were looking for possibly a murder with a reasonable suspect. Now suddenly you've got a double murder with no suspect. And it was a great concern to local people.
I spent most of my working life on the estate from being the age of 13. I got to know Tony, just through, being on the estate like I got to know everybody else. He was a lovely guy. If anybody was going to say, put Tony in a room of 10 other people, who would get murdered, you wouldn't put Tony, you'd say, well, what's he doing here? It was that shocking that, it was just beyond belief, really.
The local press, the local radio, everybody was covering this big story, which was very helpful because it was a big story.
We've got here 2 brutal killings, a massive manhunt, something the like of which Morecambe had never seen before. And we were in the centre of it, being the town's newspaper, and we were swept up by it, and without a doubt we realised the enormity of the story and that we had to rise to this challenge.
Lancashire police had 2 dead bodies on their hands and no idea who could have committed the murders. The most dramatic investigation they had ever been faced with was about to commence. Police in Morecambe were dealing with a brutal double murder and no suspect. The body of Tony Morocco had been found at his garage business, and his co-worker Paul Sandham was found a mile down the road in a field. He'd been stabbed 41 times.
When people learned of what had happened to Tony and Paul, it was just pure shock. Or anybody on the estate could quite believe what had happened. It was unreal, just unreal.
Tony Morocco was very well known. He had a wide circle of friends and a big customer base. His partner Paul probably was lesser well known, but he'd obviously known to all the customers.
Sad thing for Paul. Paul had just recovered from cancer. Had gone through a gruelling time with that. To have his life pulled away from him in one flash of it, it was absolutely shocking.
After speaking to friends and family, police started investigating Tony's business, hoping to find a clue that would lead them to the murderer.
The kind of work that Tony was involved in, the purchase and sale of low-value vehicles, indicated to us that it was largely a cash business, but there was no cash found on the body. So we did some checks, and we were right that there should have been some cash there. It looked like a robbery might have been the motive. In addition to that, Mrs. Morocco was able to tell us that Tony had a heavy gold chain around his neck, which he never took off, I think for sentimental reasons, except for just one occasion when he'd broken a link and it was repaired by a local jeweller. And that was missing as well.
Armed with their evidence, police began building a picture of what could have happened on that fateful night.
It became apparent to us that Paul Sandham had been taken away and murdered first. We guessed that this Toyota car had been used to take him away, presumably on a test drive, and he killed him in the field and then come back in the Toyota and crashed it into the garage when he arrived. We tend to assume that he'd gone along there, found two members of staff there which he thought he couldn't overcome them, so on the pretext of wanting to buy a car, had got Paul Sandham away and killed him so he could go back and rob Tony.
Regardless of their theory, police still needed concrete evidence that the murders were linked and the Toyota car was significant.
It's very important to isolate the two scenes to make sure there's no contamination, because we wanted to find out if that car had been in the field. So we found next to the road, we got a tyre track, which eventually found matched the Toyota, but also, more importantly, we found soil of identical makeup in the footwell of the car as was in the entrance to the field. Now, the important thing was this was found on the driver's side and not the passenger's side. So it showed only one person who had been out of the car got back into it, and that was the driver. And that had gone back to TM Motors.
For me, more significantly, there was a trainer mark in mud in the field close to Paul Sandham's body. And there was also a similar trainer mark in blood in TM Motors. So it was clear to us that the murders were linked, and they feel the trainer mark was a definite scientific link between those two murders.
With the crashed Toyota car left at the garage, police needed to establish how the killer had travelled around.
One of the lines of inquiry which we had was to try to establish whether or not there was a getaway vehicle involved and whether or not anybody had seen it. The only thing that we could find out was that somebody dimly recalled seeing a pedal cycle propped up against the wall outside TM Motors. And to be honest, I don't think that the police put a great deal of store by that at the time, because who goes to commit a murder on a pedal cycle?
One of the members of staff of the garage who worked there part-time came in to help us, and he checked to see that all the cars were there, and he found there was one missing. And this was a white MG Metro, which was probably the best of the bunch of cars that were in the garage, and that one was missing. Not only was the car missing, but also the paperwork, the logbook and the receipts and that for the vehicle. So clearly the murderer had not only just taken the car as a getaway, he'd also made sure he got all the documents for it. So clearly he probably intended to move the car on later, and that was important to us. I mean, it tells you a lot about the person you're looking for, that this isn't somebody who's just done something on the spur of the moment. The fact that he's lured one man away to kill him just so he can go back and do a petty robbery shows this is a dangerous and determined person.
DCI Gooch had another suspicion about the murderer's connection to the crime scene.
Did he know the garage? Had he been there before? You take the idea, he wouldn't have come from a million miles away. It's fairly tucked away on the White Lund estate. It's something somebody local would have known, or somebody who knew the area very well. He wouldn't have just turned up there from a long way away and gone there on spec.
With the white Metro missing, they now had a vehicle to look out for. The car was placed on the police national computer as a vehicle of interest, and also flagged with other relevant organisations.
There is an organisation which members of the public and car dealers can use to check whether or not a vehicle is stolen. We contacted that organisation and asked that if anybody checks that vehicle with them, that they should tell us, but not tell them.
So, having put a marker for the MG Metro onto HPI, only a couple of days later, they called us to say that someone had gone into a garage in Erith in southeast London to sell the car.
The hire purchase information alert was an important breakthrough, but this meant geographically the investigation had to expand 275 miles down south.
Very quickly, we sent a team down to London to check this out. And the man in the garage did a few second-hand cars. He did repairs and lower end of the market sort of cars. And he remembered the man who had taken in, because he'd done a few deals with him before. And he checked it, and there was nothing outstanding on HPI at that time. So a deal was done, and he part exchanged it for a Ford Escort.
The Erith car dealer provided an accurate description of the man that had sold him the white Metro, but wasn't much more help to the police, as the suspect had covered his tracks.
He'd given false particulars, which gave us something to look at, but essentially it looked like a bit of a dead end. We didn't have any more information to go on then.
Unfortunately, and perhaps alarmingly, the car dealer had traded on the MG Metro, but luckily for us, he knew where it was, and we were able to catch up with the vehicle pretty soon thereafter. And so we seized it, we brought it back to Lancashire, and had it examined by our scientific officers. They found traces of blood on the driver's door handle, and it would have been reasonable to expect that it was either Mr. Morocco or Mr. Sandham's, but it wasn't. This was the blood of a third person. And we began to speculate that perhaps in the frenzied attack on the two deceases, maybe, just maybe, the murderer had cut himself, and that this was in fact the murderer's blood.
It was looking like a DNA breakthrough. All police needed was a match.
Another important element that came in then was the car that he'd bought from the dealer in Erith, because we had the registration number for that. And then we found, by putting that on the police national computer, we found the car had been stopped in the City of London. Now, what was happening at that time, there was anti-terrorist procedures. Now, the officer who stopped him couldn't actually remember it, but we knew it was near one of the CCTVs that was part of what they call the Ring of Steel around the City of London at the time. Now, when we got that film back, there was the car with a man driving it. Now, the pictures were a bit fuzzy, not good enough to identify, but we noticed that the hand on the steering wheel appeared to be bandaged.
Using the description supplied by the Erith car dealer, the police released a sketch of the suspect to the national press, hoping it might trigger more leads.
After we'd released the artist impression, I got a phone call in the major incident room from a detective from the Kent Constabulary. And he told me quite definitively, "Here, Gov, I think I know who did your murders." And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This sounded like a breakthrough.
There appeared to be a link with a man who'd been robbing jewellery shops in Kent.
There was some CCTV footage of one of the robberies where the offender was particularly and gratuitously violent towards the shop assistant, punching her in the face when there was absolutely no need to do that. DC Cullen was one of the officers involved in that investigation. He told me that he thought the person responsible for our murders was a man by the name of Terence Derrick Clifton.
Clifton was a suspect in the robberies, and having seen the artist's impression of the man Lancashire police were trying to track down, DC Cullen had thought the resemblance uncanny.
We did some quick checks on the name and the date of birth provided to us by Dick Cullen, and I was delighted to find that Clifton had a conviction in Lancashire, but not just Lancashire, Morecambe. This clearly made a connection between a man who lived in the South East London area and sleepy old Morecambe in Lancashire.
I think when the link was made with the earlier crimes, the robberies of the jewellers, for example, it became apparent that this was an individual who was on the fringes of society, who seemed to see himself as outside the law, somebody who's very much playing by his own rules, maybe with his own sense of purpose.
Armed with their new evidence, the police moved quickly. The hunt was on for Terry Clifton. In their search for a double killer, Lancashire police had identified a prime suspect. All they needed to do now is find him. Intelligence pointed to a man called Terence Clifton for the murders of Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham. But they were yet to track Clifton down and still needed evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime.
Now, one of the important things is on Tony Morocco's body, there was an awful lot of blood. And when they looked at his trousers, they'd taken blood samples from about 6 sites, which is the normal thing to do. And they'd all been the same blood group, and they'd all been Tony's blood. However, they went back to it then and looked inside the pocket where his money would have been. And inside the pocket, another blood sample was taken, and that turned out that that wasn't Tony's. So suddenly, here we had the blood sample from the murderer, we thought. So now the case is really building up. We've got this suggested name from the intelligence officer in Kent. We've got a description that would appear to be matched. And now we've got blood from the murderer in the pocket of the deceased. So now we've got to match it.
Clifton had been in prison before, but this was 1995, when personal profile details held on convicts were limited.
Nowadays it's quite routine for people coming into custody to have a mouth swab taken with a view to having their DNA recorded on the National DNA Database. But that wasn't the case way back then. So what we needed was a sample of Clifton's blood to compare with the blood of the third person from the crime scenes and from the MG Metro.
The investigation was now a nationwide search, and Lancashire police gathered as much support as they could without naming their suspect.
We always enjoyed a pretty good relationship with the police, and on this particular incident, it was outstanding, because partly the police needed us as well to help catch the guy.
We decided to release the artist's impressions to the local paper, and that brought about another development. A young lady came to the police station, and she said that based on the artist's impression, she thought that the person that we were looking for was none other than Terence Clifton. She explained that Terence had attended school in the area, and significantly that he had been in the Morecambe area around the Christmas and New Year period of 1995. The witness went on to say that Clifton had arrived in the area in a big old BMW car that he'd driven up from London, but that he had sold it and bought another car locally. And it came as no surprise that transaction took place at T&M Motors. In fact, the BMW was still lying in the yard at T&M when we went to check.
He'd gone to trade this old car in, and he wasn't happy that Tony had only given him a couple £100 for it or something like that. And then he wanted money because there was petrol in the tank. And Tony took out his big wad of money and peeled off a £5 and said, there's £5 for the petrol. And he very much resented that.
The police now had an additional motive for the murders: revenge.
So the woman who went into Morecambe Police Station to say she'd seen Clifton and knew him was able to tell us that he'd stayed with a family in Morecambe the night before the murders. And when we saw them, they were able to tell us, yes, he'd stayed there the night before.
The people that Clifton had been staying with were also able to say that one day he came out onto the street where his car was parked to find that the tyres had been slashed, and he was extremely annoyed. He turned to his schoolmate, the person he'd been stopping with, and asked to borrow his pedal cycle, saying that he was going to go down to the Whiteland estate where he knew a couple of blokes who were going to sort him out a motor. This, of course, explained why no car was seen at T&M Motors and explained the presence of a pedal cycle propped up against the door at the relevant time. A little while later, Clifton appeared back at the family home. Then he was driving a white hatchback car, and the pedal cycle belonging to the young man with whom he'd been staying was sticking out the back. So he returned the pedal cycle and set off, saying that he was bound back for London.
Police confiscated the bike for forensic testing, where blood was found that matched that on the white Metro and in Tony Morocco's pocket. But they couldn't connect this blood to their suspect.
So we're obviously waiting for a DNA match to see whether or not we could definitively tie that blood to Terence Derek Clifton, but at that stage we didn't have it.
The police could only get the blood test they needed if they were able to arrest Clifton.
We'd already had officers down in London after the initial call, but now we sent more of a team down there to try to find him. And it was becoming very difficult. He certainly didn't make it easy for us. He was changing cars almost daily. And then he was moving from place to place where he was staying, and we always seemed to be a bit behind him.
I get a sense of a continuing theme of him versus the world. Him seeing himself as this character, almost a heroic character who can rise above adversity and demonstrate, in some respects, a superiority. He can give the police the runaround and get away with pretty much what he chooses.
When it was a bit of a manhunt to London, well then you think, Jesus, help me catch him. Everybody was sort of like shocked and look, it was very hard for everybody. I mean, it's all right for me to sit here saying it was hard. Imagine what his family felt like.
At this point, Lancashire Constabulary had officers at a police station in Bexley Heath in Kent, and they also had backup from the Metropolitan Police.
The murder investigation was turning into a manhunt. He was always giving an alias, but there was a common theme to those aliases.
Whilst he was going around giving people false names and addresses to people who didn't know him, there were clues in it for us, because a lot of the names he was given were sort of mix and match of places he'd lived before and people who he had known or relatives. At one of the addresses at which he'd stayed, we found a gold Belcher chain which he'd swapped for some cannabis. And we were able to take that to a jeweller in Lancaster who had repaired it, and he was able to identify it as being the chain he'd repaired for Tony Morocco.
Then the manhunt suddenly turned a corner, when on the 27th of February 1995, 1 month into the investigation, police pursued a lead in Erith in Kent.
Well, the officers went to the 7th floor flat of one of Clifton's ex-girlfriends, because we had reason to suspect he was there. So as they were going through the front door, the officer who was down on the ground saw Clifton backing out of the flat and holding a sawn-off shotgun pointing in towards the flat. So we've now gone up a stage because he's armed and we know he's dangerous. But then he put the gun down and went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. He just let go on each floor and dropped, and then just grabbed the railing of the flat below to slow himself down. And he did that all the way down to the ground, and then he ran off. After that, the press in London called him Spider-Man, and that was it.
I think part of my feelings at the time was I wish he'd fell off that tower block halfway down. The man was a psychopath.
The police recovered the discarded shotgun, but now knew Clifton had access to firearms. He was now a huge danger to the public, and he was on the run.
Then we took the unusual step of publicising his name. Normally you don't publish the names of suspects until somebody's charged. But with this man on the loose and being so dangerous, we had to do that in the hope that people would come forward and tell us where he is, because nobody wants him on the loose in their community, because if he can do this sort of thing, he might do the same to them.
It was unnerving because the sheer brutality of it kept people on edge. They'd never known anything like it before. Somebody capable of doing that was capable of doing anything.
Two grieving families, a community on guard, and an armed killer. It was more urgent than ever. The police were closing in on Terence Clifton, who they believed had killed Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham in cold blood.
The London team had been chasing down the long chain of cars that Clifton had been buying and selling them. And they were hot on the trail of one particular car when they identified it parked up in a street. So the Metropolitan Police, firearms team and Lancashire officers kept a watch on the car. And a man came to the car and got in. He was immediately surrounded by the armed officers and was arrested at gunpoint. Unfortunately, it wasn't Clifton. It was, however, a man who'd bought the car from Clifton only a number of hours previously. And once he'd been dusted down, he was able to tell us that, and to tell us the car that Clifton had bought off him. We were now only hours behind our suspect.
Clifton was reported to be driving an Austin Montego.
Now, in possession of information that he was in the Montego motor car, there were a number of officers plotted up in the area, and then two officers saw him get into the car, and then he went round and parked up in Finstead Road. It was called in, and the armed team then went in, and he was arrested. He surrendered straight away.
Finally, they'd got Clifton. Arrested at gunpoint on the 6th of March 1995, 6 weeks after the murders.
We had him now. And so it's a great relief that this man's no longer on the streets. He's a very dangerous man, and he's now locked up. So that was a huge relief. But then, you see, the job from my end of things particularly is really just starting, because now you've got to put all that evidence together to turn it into a case of admissible evidence.
When news of the arrest came through, it came as a relief to us, and I think also to our readers and obviously the families, that we were able to print the fact that finally this person the police had been looking for so long and who had been involved in so many escape dramas had finally been arrested, and that we were getting somewhere.
Police needed to prove that blood found on the stolen white Metro, the pushbike connected to the crime, and in Tony Morocco's pocket, belonged to Clifton. They took DNA swabs from him and awaited the results.
Yes, having been arrested down in London, then obviously he had to be brought up to Lancaster, where he was held, and we questioned him, and he thought he could be cleverer than us, if you like, because he was told briefly what the evidence was. And he said he happened to be walking through the White London Industrial Estate, like you do, and he'd seen this car parked at the roadside, the white Metro, with the keys in it and all the documents lying on the seat. And he just intended to steal the car. And that was his defence.
He was rational, he was polite, he admitted the theft of the MG Metro, but claimed that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the murders. So, following the interviews, we decided that we were going to charge him, notwithstanding the fact that we didn't have the DNA evidence at that stage. We did feel that we had sufficient evidence to charge, and we did.
Clifton was remanded in custody while he awaited trial, and several weeks later the results of his DNA swab came through, which, as police suspected, was a match with DNA evidence from the double murder.
We had this man with a history of extreme violence. We had a man who knew the area, despite the fact he had a London address. He'd been to school in Morecambe. He was known to be in the area. He'd borrowed a bicycle to go to the garage and had come back later with the white Metro with the bicycle in it, with blood on it, which was his blood. Then we had his blood in Tony Morocco's pocket at the scene. We then had footprints at the scene of that murder and at the scene of Paul Sandham's murder. We could link the two scenes again because of the earth from the field and the earth in the driver's footwell of the Toyota that Clifton had then driven back to the garage. We've got the Belcher chain that was found in London that he'd swapped for some cannabis, which we could then identify positively as being Tony Morocco's. So we got an awful lot of evidence to make a case for the prosecution.
So in the next few months, Clifton made a number of appearances both at the Crown Court and at the Magistrates' Court as part of the process leading towards his eventual trial. His behaviour had deteriorated from that at the time of his interview. He assaulted a prison officer on one occasion and blew raspberries at the judge on another occasion.
On Saturday, the 24th of June 1995, Clifton was due to be formally committed for trial at Lancashire Magistrates' Court.
And then we came to the worst of all in his behaviour. He said he wanted private consultation with his solicitor, which he is entitled. So was taken into a room with his solicitor. Then he produced a sharpened telescopic car aerial, which he'd secreted within his rectum before he left prison, and then held this against his solicitor's throat and threatened him and took him hostage.
We called in a hostage negotiator, and we also called in officers who were trained to put an end to a siege like this by more forceful means.
I remember getting a call from a colleague at quite an early hour of the morning to say that there was an incident in progress at Lancaster Magistrates' Court. At that time, I worked for the prison service, and I was on call for hostage negotiation situations.
Dr. Need made his way to the court, while Lancashire police tried to manage the situation as best they could.
As part of this siege, he called for an imam to come and speak to him, claiming that he was a convert to Islam, and the imam duly came and spoke to him and declared that, in his opinion, he wasn't a convert.
When I arrived, everybody was rather tired, but above all, I think, attention focused on the well-being of the hostage.
The siege itself, from the time we took him, lasted for some 21 hours. So it's gone on a long time. And of course, when you're dealing with somebody like that, who's not that well balanced and clearly dangerous, as time goes on, they're getting tired, and either they give up or they can get worse and worse. At the end, things were getting worse, and that's why there had to be a rapid intervention.
It was decided that we should explore the possibility of tactical intervention, and that really centred upon separating Clifton from the hostage. And that was achieved by offering Clifton a cup of coffee, which he accepted, took a few steps over to reach for it, and at that point the door to the room burst open and several gentlemen jumped on him. So it was brought to a peaceful resolution.
It was erratic behaviour, and it may have been just part of the delaying tactics. I'm not sure what he felt that he had to gain by taking his solicitor hostage. It seemed to me to be the last turn of the card of an increasingly desperate man.
Clifton's troublemaking continued. He sacked his defence lawyer and told police he would represent himself. The trial at Preston Crown Court didn't happen for 2 years.
So eventually he came up for trial in January of 1997. And then when it came to the day of trial, he refused to come out of the cell and face his own trial.
Because Clifton was unrepresented, it meant that the witnesses were not cross-examined, although the judge maintained the impartiality of the trial by asking pertinent questions of the witnesses himself. But nonetheless, the pace of the trial was much quicker than you would normally expect. And I recall that on one occasion, in excess of 30 witnesses in one day were heard.
At the trial, the injuries sustained by Tony Morocco were so bad, it took the pathologist like 45 minutes just to describe the injuries. And the family sat through all that.
The jury didn't take a long time at all to convict him of the murders. In a matter of 40 minutes or so, they'd returned unanimous verdicts of guilty to 2 offences of murder and 1 of the theft of the white MG car.
All that was left was to sentence Clifton for his horrific crimes.
The judge insisted, quite rightly, he'd be brought up for sentencing, and he wasn't for going quietly. And it took 9 prison officers a long time, having to have him wrap him in sheets to stop him kicking and punching and biting the officers, and they carried him up to the dock where he heard the sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment twice over for each of the murders and 4 years for stealing the car. The family who'd sat throughout the trial listened to the dreadful things that happened to their relatives, and I think they were very relieved at the outcome of the trial and the fact that he was going away, hopefully forever.
It was the most shocking and demanding investigation Lancashire police had ever seen, but finally it had come to an end.
The chain of events, working backwards from the siege to the escape from the balcony, the fact that it was a double murder, the fact that it was a manhunt, I just don't think that anybody could have written a credible script that could have fitted our scenario.
We knew we weren't far away, and we knew if we kept going, then eventually we'd get him, and we did.
After 3 months playing cat and mouse with the police, a sensational escape and a hostage situation, Terry Clifton would be an old man if and when he was ever released. And finally, the town of Morecambe could start trying to get back to normal.
With 5-star reviews across the board and immense performances from Jodie Foster and Kaylee Reese, True Detective Night Country is available now on Sky Atlantic.